Hyperactive from Thomas Dolby's album The Flat Earth. That track came with one of music history's most innovative videos, and with me now is Thomas Dolby, who recently released a new album, Map of the Floating City, from which we'll be playing some tracks. Thomas, thank you for coming on to Revenge of the 80s Radio with me.
Hey, thank you, Chris. It's nice to be back after 20 years with no music whatsoever.
Well, you did spend some time over here just about a month or so ago. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about your new album, as well as the interactive social media game that you created with it. But let's start here. When you were first creating music in the 1980s, you took the concept of synthesizer-oriented new wave to a new level. What brought you into the world of electronic music?
I suppose really it was that growing up in London during the age of punk rock, I didn't feel terribly stimulated by the sort of three-chord thrash of bands like the Pistols and the Clash. And so I was drawn to a couple of things. One was German electronic music by people like Kraftwerk and Tangerine Dream. And the second was the underground London electronic movement, which was sort of inspired really by Bowie and Eno's work in the mid-70s, but was played out on a day-to-day basis by bands like Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire, The Human League and Soft Cell.
A lot of future artists list you as an inspiration. What fascinated you about Kraftwerk, Bowie, and people like that made them your inspiration?
I suppose it was really the idea of making pop music entirely with electronic instruments that I found interesting. I've always enjoyed being an explorer in musical terms, going to areas where there are very few people working and helping to uncover some of the possibilities of a new genre. And that's been true whether it's electronic music, whether it's music videos, whether it's games or the web or mobile devices. I'm just at my most creative when I'm working in a previously unexplored area. And so I suppose that's what drew me to electronic music in the first place and has really guided my career.
Thomas, She Blinded Me with Science was your breakthrough hit in the U.S. You were already well known in the U.K. at the time, but this track really seemed to take on a life of its own. What about that song do you think made it a timeless pop hit?
Yeah, everybody was talking about the British invasion, and there were bands like Duran Duran and Adamant, Spandau Ballet, and the Police and so on that were really leading that charge. But I came along with a catchy song and a catchy look and video, which kind of went against the grain. I was not a poster child by any means. I took my image for that video from my father, who was a sort of nutty Oxford professor of classical archaeology, and did something a little bit different. I was always into the silent movie anti-heroes like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd and so on. And so when I put that video together, it arrived in the U.S. at a time when MTV was starting to get really powerful. And radio programmers for the first time were paying attention to whatever was a hit on MTV. And it coincided also with an upsurge in sort of crossover urban dance clubs. And so DJs, in the South Bronx were spinning She Blinded Me with Science in alongside rap meisters like Grandmaster Flash and Africa Bambaataa. And so that double pincer movement really is what gave me my first hit in the USA with She Blinded Me with Science.
The voiceover, the professor guy, the one you said was inspired by your father.
The voice in She Blinded Me with Science was by Dr. Magnus Pyke, who was a household name in Britain because he was on the BBC several times a week, but was really unheard of in the US. And he was actually a fully credentialed scientist who was just a bit of a nutcase and became very popular in the UK on TV. But he was not really known in the US other than as the guy out of my music video. And so it got him very upset when he would go on lecture tours in the States and people would walk up behind him on the sidewalk and go, "Science!" He said it scared him half out of his skin.
What all your hardcore fans in the U.S. appreciated in the 1980s was your experimental approach to electronic music and the fact that you were not only a tech whiz that pushed keys over manufactured beats, but your creations kept a strict musical integrity in mind with an eye toward adding new effects. Talk about Thomas Dolby the musician and how you mixed that with Thomas Dolby the tech whiz.
Yeah, I'm a musician first and foremost. Most of my songs, I could sit and play you at the piano and you would get a full impression of the song. My songwriting craft is quite conventional in many ways. I have intros, verses, choruses, middle eights, hooks, chord sequences, and then the arrangements that I do are, even when they're electronic, they have bass parts, guitar parts, drum parts, many of which I programmed myself. But the difference, really, I think, is just the personality in the music. It's quirky. It's a little different. I think that the use of electronics enabled me to create fresh sounds and flavors with the music. But underlying all of it, there are songs that make sense. And so when you hear one of my melodies in your head, you don't necessarily hear all of the sounds. You hear the song, the melody, the lyrics, the vocal. So these are songs that hopefully stand up on their own merits, with or without all of the frills.
One thing that I should note is that not only do you feature almost all electronics, the horns are real.
I suppose the privilege that I've had through being successful as a programmer of synthesizers and samplers is that I've gotten into the elevated position where I can hire an orchestra, I can hire a string section, I can hire a horn section. And so everything I know about music I've learned from experimenting on my own with synths. I don't have any classical training or conventional background in music at all. So as you can imagine, having done horns synthetically, it's very exciting to actually get with a great horn section like the Jazz Mafia horns who I used on my last solo US tour. And I used them extensively on the new album, A Map of the Floating City, to get with them and mess around with them, or with the string quartet Ethel, who also feature on the album.
Thomas Dolby is my guest on Revenge of the 80s Radio. Straight ahead, we'll talk about his new album, A Map of the Floating City, and more about Thomas Dolby, the musician and the businessman, on Revenge of the 80s Radio.